Okay, are there any questions?
Yes.
Yes.
Why is the sacrament of the Eucharist called the sacrament of obedience as compared to the other two sacraments, initiation sacraments, and what is the effect of it, or how does that make it more than the others?
Oh, yeah. In talking about the sacrament of obedience, in referencing the Eucharist as the sacrament of obedience, it's kind of a term that I would associate with it. But first, we can go back and look at the context, right? Adam and Eve's disobedience, right? This is the way that the Old Testament and the New Testament characterize. The Old Testament, right, disobedience of the first Adam brings about this rupture of relationship. St. Paul shows in the second Adam, through the second Adam, his obedience brings about the restoration. His obedience is his entire life, right? He talks about the fact that when at the woman in the well, remember that passage with the woman in the well where his disciples, come back after he's been talking to this woman, and the woman has now gone off, and they bring him some, they give him the food they went out to eat. He says that he's already eaten, and they say, well, did she give you something? He goes, no, my food, my very food, my nourishment is to do the will of my Father, right? And he also says in the Garden of Eden, right, not my will, I'm sorry, the second Garden of Eden, the Garden of Gethsemane. He says, not my will, but thy will be done. It is obedience. Obedience, we kind of see that in our society, our culture in the West especially, as almost a four-letter word. But ultimately, obedience comes from the Latin obediere, which is basically just to listen. Right? It presupposes when you see the truth and you hear the truth that you follow the truth, which is Jesus Christ. And so, Jesus Christ's whole life is obedience, but it's most perfectly represented on the cross, where the Epistle to the Hebrews says that the Son that he was learned obedience through what he suffered. Right? Not that he didn't know obedience already, but in a certain sense he learned it, he experienced it in the fullness of his humanity, in what he suffered. This is the center of obedience. This is what begins in the upper room. It begins in the upper room. His suffering begins in the upper room, and it ends on the cross. And this is the archetype. What begins in the upper room, right, is really the Passover meal. And again, we're going to talk about this a little bit more. We'll show the logic of it from in part 2. But we can see from the logic of it where we talked about in the upper room they drink the cup of blessing, which is the third cup within the Passover meal. Well, there's a fourth cup that never gets drunk until the cross, when Jesus takes that fourth cup and drinks it and then gives up his life. And he says, it is now, right, it is finished. It is consummated, which is, by the way, what the fourth cup is called, the cup of consummation. Right, so this Passover meal is the structure for both the sacrifice as well as the sacrifice of the Mass, the liturgy. The liturgy, right, Jesus Christ uses the Old Testament sacrifice and transforms it into the New Testament Eucharist, beginning in the upper room when he says, take and do this in remembrance of me. And so the Eucharist, this is why the Eucharist is also the source and sun of the Christian life, as the Catechism says. Right? All the sacraments receive their efficacy. They're ordered around and receive their efficacy from the Eucharist, because the Eucharist is most perfectly, because it is Jesus Christ's present body, blood, soul, and divinity. The Eucharist is the most perfect presence, the most full presence of Jesus Christ. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Good question. Any other questions?
So often people ask, why does the Eucharist have to be eaten? I mean, why was that the choice on this communion with us?
That's a very good question. Why is it that we would eat something? Well, the short of it, a very short answer that the early church fathers really referred to is they look back at the taking of the fruit and eating it, right? And through this consumption really is the source of really man's fall. the imagery anyway, is this taking and consuming. Right? And so consumption is in a certain sense restored to its rightful order. But consumption also in this is a radical source of unity. You see, if we look at unity, we can have unity in two ways. Okay, this is a radical unity of nature. Right? There's one divine nature that the three persons fully possess. Right? There's also this relationship of communion, which is in that same category, which brings those together, right? Now, in our humanity, we have two aspects in the visible order of being able to be created and able to reflect the communion that God has of relationship and nature in the created order. One is in the order of relationship, and one is the order of substance. In the highest level that we are, right, that we're both body and soul, one unified nature, right, not two different things brought together, but one seamless thing, one nature, right? We reflect God's communion in the order of love. That's what we call the communion of love. That is first the intellect, knowing the other, and the will, right, loving the other for their own sake, disinterested love, giving ourselves to the other for their perfection, their holiness. The rest of creation, though, you would think, because this is so primary, reflects this same kind of creation. But in visible creation, human beings are the only ones that can have relationship communions of love. So what is it that, say, higher animals, how do they reflect this? Because they can't love. It is in the order of consumption. Why? Because what consumption is, it takes what is a lower nature and brings it into itself, but it annihilates it, right? And it draws itself, we draw ourselves into it and we make it our nature. Well, in the Eucharist, the opposite happens. We take what looks like a lower nature and we draw it into ourselves, but we don't annihilate it because it's really a higher nature. It draws us up to Him. And so the consumption that Adam and Eve did, this image where they took and ate, right, instead of receiving as a gift, we now receive as a gift in our tongue. Remember, some places in our hand, most places in our hand. We receive as a gift, and we recognize it as a gift, and we say, thank you. Right? That is what Eucharist means, Eucharistia in the Latin, the Greek, which means thanksgiving. So it is most appropriate to what we are as human persons, body, spiritual, soul, one thing that has both of these aspects to it, that we have this communion of love in the higher aspect of our nature. At the same time, we have this communion of love, if you will, this one flesh union in the material aspect